Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures.
We're going to pick up right there. Now, I've said this several times, but I'm going to say it one more time at least. Part of the reason why the mood disorder chapter got split is we think that these are two different processes going on in the body. Even though both have mood symptoms and both can have depression, the underlying mechanism appears to be two different things. And part of why that is because of how they're treated. So generally speaking, we don't prescribe antidepressants to people who have bipolar disorders, even though they may sometimes have episodes of depression. The reason why they're generally not recommended is because they can trigger a manic episode. In fact, sometimes that's how we find out somebody has bipolar disorder. They show up with a depressive episode. We recognize that it is depression. We diagnose depression. We give them an antidepressant. And then instead of that 4 to 6 weeks to get a therapeutic dose and gradually improve, it will trigger a manic episode in a very short period of time for that person. And then that's how we know, oh my gosh, this person does not have depression. They have bipolar disorder. So if we can't use those antidepressants, what can we use? Well, typically, we're looking for medications that are going to target dopamine and serotonin. The first drug we discovered, and this is still one of the first ones we tried, is lithium. Now, it's not the same lithium that's in your cell phone battery. That's pure lithium. That's toxic, and it will kill you. Please don't eat a battery. This is a type of salt that contains lithium. So it's a lithium-mated salt. And it does have the ability to be toxic to the body. So people who are prescribed lithium do have to be monitored very carefully, particularly the thyroid is very sensitive to lithium. And so we have to monitor people when they're taking this particular medication. Now, the interesting thing about the lithium salt is, unlike many of the other medications we've talked about, this one doesn't mimic or block the action of a neurotransmitter in the same way that maybe the SSRIs would do. What it does is it affects the salt pumps in the cell itself. So in order for the cell to fire, they have to pump in positively charged ions and then reset and pump those ions out and pump them back in. And that's what happens every time a neuron fires. And so this lithium-mated salt, we think, is affecting that pumping mechanism, which in turn affects how the neurons fire. So it has a little bit of a different mechanism of action. Now, there are some other medications that we will sometimes prescribe. These are sometimes combined with an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication. They're not usually prescribed by themselves. One is antipsychotic medications, and antipsychotics were originally prescribed for psychoses, but we find that they have other uses as well. They block dopamine and serotonin, and that's why we think they may be beneficial for bipolar-related disorder. You don't need to know the specific names of those medications, but I did put some up there because sometimes people are like, I don't know antipsychotics, and then you hear things like Seroquel, and you're like, oh yeah, I've heard of that one. That's an antipsychotic. And the anticonvulsants, what we have found is that these medications that we would normally be prescribing to somebody who maybe had epileptic seizures can also benefit people who have bipolar-related disorders. And so oftentimes we kind of experiment with different medications until we find the right combination that works for a particular individual. Whatever medication people are prescribed, It is prescribed for continual use. So when we talked about depression, we talked about medication treatment for 6 months after symptoms got better. And then in most cases, attempting to come down off of that medication and live without it. Now, people who have recurrent episodes may end up chronically taking an antidepressant. Bipolar disorder, by definition, is chronic. These medications don't fix it. They don't cure it. They manage it. Much like somebody who has diabetes would have insulin, or somebody who has asthma would have a medication like an inhaled steroid to help. So they're managing the symptoms, but you have to take them every day. Even with taking them, people still have some symptoms. The side effects of these medications are unpleasant. People describe feeling low in energy. They experience weight gain, affects their metabolism. And in the case of lithium, we talked about the thyroid damage. In the case of the anticonvulsants, they can damage the liver and can also cause neuronal damage at too high of a dose because they are affecting those neurons significantly. Antipsychotics have a set of side effects that can become permanent. Tardive dyskinesia looks a lot like Parkinson's disease, and it's caused by people using these antipsychotics at too high a dose for too long a period of time. So sometimes we see people not taking the medication because they don't like these side effects or they're concerned about the toxicity. So non-compliance with medication is pretty common. And so if you don't take your medication regularly, that increases that risk of mania. And we see an increased risk of suicide, especially in people who rapidly discontinue their medication. So they maybe take those meds well for several months and then stop cold turkey. That can increase the risk for suicide. And again, they do this most often because they don't like the side effects of the medication. Some people also complain about missing the mild, almost dysfunctional, not quite dysfunctional, hypomanic-like elevations. You've got extra energy. You've got all kinds of great ideas that pop into your head. I kind of like that. And so you might miss that sensation or that feeling. And so people may not take their medication because they miss that. So those are our medical treatments. From a psychosocial standpoint, we don't recommend psychosocial treatments on their own. Medication is always, always, always a part of the bipolar treatment plan. But if we combine the medication with the psychosocial, that has the best long-term effects. Part of what we do is we do some cognitive behavioral therapy. We monitor the symptoms and try to catch people if they're starting to experience a slip in mood. And then we can do some relapse prevention things to try to get them stabilized before they swing too high or too low into extreme mania or depression. Part of it is also about monitoring that medication compliance, other things that you can do to manage those side effects or symptoms. We talked last time about how psychosocial issues don't cause the mood swings. They don't cause the mania, but they can be a trigger. And so managing those psychosocial stressors can be an important part of managing repeated episodes. During depressive episodes, because we can't always prescribe an antidepressant, psychosocial treatments for depression would be particularly important here. And then, as with all the disorders, good neurological health habits are going to be an important part of managing any psychological disorder. Particularly for bipolar, though, we see adequate sleep being important. People with bipolar disorder have extremely disrupted sleep patterns, and that puts them at increased risk. So having good sleep is going to be particularly important. All right, so that wraps up Chapter 6